Hello, and welcome to this week's podcast, The Changes We Face, Part 2, Food Poisoning. Today's episode is going to be a little bit on the long side, but I wanted to really give you guys all the information I could because this is a subject near and dear to my heart. RFK has been a passionate advocate for ending the chronic disease epidemic in this country, and it seems to be because of his association with a food safety expert named Callie Means, who used to work for the food and pharma companies until his sister Casey, a surgeon from Stanford Medical School, began opening his eyes to the systemic problems which the medical community was being incentivized to accept as a given. Then they were trained to offer ineffective Band-Aid treatments once the resulting health problem had already appeared, instead of addressing the source of problems that shouldn't be this commonplace. Callie and Casey became passionate about this issue themselves after their mother died suddenly of pancreatic cancer. It was already at stage 4 by the time it was discovered, and she died only 12 days later. But Callie and Casey don't believe that cancers like this are random, like we are all told. They are more likely the result of years of being bombarded with toxins. By ignoring the metabolic health issues which patients like their mother had, issues like high cholesterol and high blood pressure, these warning signs weren't viewed as warning signs that more serious things were going to start going wrong if the foundation of bodily health isn't addressed and continues to be ignored. We simply treat these issues, mostly ineffectively, with pills. We don't even try to get to the cause of why is it happening in the first place. Not too long ago, this brother-sister team appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast for an in-depth 3-hour discussion. And since this is a subject that directly affects me in significant ways, which I touched on briefly during my election coverage, I wanted to really help get some of this information out there. Based on the stats, this issue is probably affecting quite a lot of you people out there too, and it could begin affecting your kids and loved ones soon, if it hasn't already. So it's a topic that needs to be moved front and center, both for the well-being of the people affected, but also because of the economic implications which are going to single-handedly break us in this country if we don't start addressing it, and soon. Callie and Casey were raised in Washington, D.C. at a time when being a good, patriotic conservative meant supporting capitalism through supporting big industries. They both went to Stanford, where she studied biology and he studied political science and economics. Then he started going on campaigns and became a lobbyist. According to Callie, everyone who becomes a bipartisan lobbyist ends up going to work for the food and pharmacy industries. He found himself quickly so far gone in this world that he was actually helping pharma steer money to the dean of Stanford Medical School, who was a pain specialist, in order to get him to be part of an NIH panel that would state that the 2011 concerns about opioid addiction were overblown. They even got the NIH panel to issue a report saying that since pain is a crisis, the dangers posed by the widespread long-term use of opioids were acceptable and actually necessary to combat the pain that was, for some reason, so commonplace. Simultaneously, Callie was working for food companies and Coke, helping them steer money to the NAACP, which would then in turn make claims that taking unhealthy products like Coke off of the food stamp program would somehow be racist. It was a way of manipulating the system for the company's benefit. To this day, Coke is the number one item bought with food stamps. Quote, "What I realized fundamentally is that we are profiting. The biggest industries, the biggest spenders in the country are profiting from kids particularly getting addicted, sick, and fear, and then drugging them and profiting from that." End quote. According to Callie, the problem isn't that evil people are conspiring in dark back rooms to hurt unsuspecting innocent people. The problem is that the system gives good people plausible deniability. At the time, it was well-meaning staffers like Callie who were just doing whatever it took to get opioids to the masses because pain is such a terrible thing to live with, as I know from decades of experience. Now, the same thing is going on with the obesity epidemic, which has resulted in Ozempic being the official standard of care for children as young as 6 years old. When it comes to medications, he says that people tell themselves that they are just making sure that the option is widely available. With the food industries, it's about making cheap calories available to children in poverty. They really believe that they are just promoting choice, like Callie did at the time. Callie believes more and more people are becoming aware of the harmful direction that this now gargantuan system has been heading in for a while, and that this awareness is reflected in the burnout rates and the suicide rates among doctors, as well as the rates of chronic depression among elite business professionals. Most of these people went into these professions to do good, but they quickly end up seeing how truly impossible it is to do that while fighting a system that is stacked against them. The biggest problems we are facing right now on so many fronts is that so many institutions, powerful institutions, have become captured and are set up to stay that way because they are insulated with the accumulative regulations created by a bloated bureaucracy. This is why Callie believes that so many people have begun turning to powerful forces outside of the system as their last hope. That's why they chose people like Elon Musk and, yes, Donald Trump, etc. We see the same complete capture evidenced in the university system, the pharmaceutical and healthcare systems, even in the military-industrial complex. And I, like many others, shared Casey's concerns that it could lead to a societal collapse if drastic action isn't taken to address it. Even though there are those who still label all of this as alarmist, that dismissal doesn't carry a lot of weight, coming from the same sources that have completely blown their own credibility repeatedly. And the sad reality is that they exist now only to preach to the choir. The vast majority of people aren't listening to their gaslighting denials anymore. And in the months to come, when no concentration camps appear, no prosecutions of political enemies fill the courtrooms, no federal bans on all abortions or nationwide period tracking is put in place, no poison is hidden in baby formula, etc., the few people who are still listening will realize how ridiculous they were to ever give any credence in the first place to the people who warned them that all of that and more would happen under a Trump presidency. Casey went to Stanford Medical School and then did her residency in head and neck surgery, completely immersed in climbing the ranks of the medical system, from student to intern to resident to specialist. But despite this all-consuming world, there was a nagging voice that kept growing louder with every patient she saw, saying that something wasn't right. She was doing 3 to 5 surgeries every day, working full work weeks, but she was only helping people for a little while, and every time she looked up, it became obvious that the public's health was a growing disaster. Quote, "I just started looking at the data in a different way. It's unbelievable. Like, we are getting destroyed, and it's very recent, and it's accelerating. The stats speak for themselves. 74%, 3 out of 4, Americans are overweight or obese. 50% now of American adults have type 2 diabetes or prediabetes. There was 1% of Americans in 1950 who had type 2 diabetes. Alzheimer's, dementia are going through the roof. Young adult dementias have increased like 3 times since 2012. So, early onset dementia, 1 in 2 Americans are expected to have cancer in their lifetime now. 1 in 2. And young adult cancers are going up 79% in the last 10 years. The autism rates are absolutely astronomical. 1 in 36 children has autism now in the United States. That was 1 in 150 in the year 2020. Meaning that it is multiplied by 5 times in just 25 years, people. Continuing with her quote, and in California, where I live, it's 1 in 22. That would be up by 7 times. 1 in 22 with a lifetime neurodevelopmental disorder. We've got infertility going up 1% per year. 25% of men now under 40 have erectile dysfunction. A quarter of the country. This is fundamentally a metabolic disease. We've got 77%, that would be 4/5, of young Americans who can't serve in the military because of obesity or drug abuse. We've got autoimmune disease. Some studies say they're going up 13% per year. It's really unbelievable. And I could go through so many more diseases. We've got heart disease, which is almost totally preventable, as the leading cause of death in the United States, killing around 800,000 people per year. Why are these all going up all at once? What I realize is that when you go to the science with a root cause perspective, you go back to PubMed with a slightly different perspective. Not how do I treat these diseases once they emerge, but why are they happening? You see a very obvious blaring answer, which is that it's all caused by metabolic dysfunction, a term that I never learned in medical school. There is a fundamental breaking of our core cellular biology that is caused by our diet and the modern world we're living in today that is crashing the very way that our human cells can transmit food energy into life energy, to cellular energy. Because metabolic health is how we make energy in the body, it's basically like all of us are a little bit dead while we're alive. That's what metabolic dysfunction is. It's less energy in the body. We're underpowered, and that's very dark. We could fix it really quickly if we all woke up and looked at the data and put pieces together. But of course, we're not trained to connect dots. That's not our job in medicine. We are trained to follow algorithms and to be reactive. I think the reason that there's a MAHA movement, meaning Make America Healthy Again, the reason that people are so passionate about your podcast, meaning Rogan's, that talks about this so much, people know that something's not right. And people know that this health issue is the tip of the iceberg of what's actually happening in our world today. Our human health is simply a reflection of the destroyed ecosystem of our globe. The fact that we've forgotten that we're completely connected to nature and we're completely interdependent with nature. Humans have become so powerful and so technologically advanced and so connected in recent decades that we now actually do have the power to both destroy the world and destroy our health. We totally have a choice right now. I do believe this is the moment that we need to decide. Are we going to address these interdependent issues and be courageous enough to fight for this? Or are we going to let ourselves be told that there's nothing wrong, nothing to see here, while our health and the health of the planet is just absolutely being destroyed? End quote. I agree with Rogan that once you start looking at the data, the problem is incontrovertible. And yet so few people are talking about it. Virtually no one in the mainstream media is. Certainly no one on the left, which used to be the headquarters for the health-conscious naturalist types. Only independent shows like Rogan's that don't rely on the network executives whose whole advertising budget comes from big pharma and the food industry are even willing to talk to the experts who have piles of data about this problem and its scale. By the way, the USA is one of only 2 nations in the world that even allow pharmaceutical companies to advertise. It's us in New Zealand. And Fox News has been the only mainstream network willing to brave their wrath by letting Callie and Casey even come on to speak so far. Callie pointed out how interconnected all of these metabolic diseases really are. Alzheimer's is now classified as type 3 diabetes. If you don't have type 2 diabetes or prediabetes, your chances of getting Alzheimer's is radically decreased. But a specialist who goes through medical school under the current system simply knows that Alzheimer's exists, and it's growing, and nothing can be done about that. There is no emphasis on preventing it or even on understanding why it is here and growing. They focus only on the marginal improvements that can be made in treating it. As Callie said, these are the most highly educated people in the world, and yet they know nothing about what is causing these diseases. They are only supposed to accept them and work on making, sadly, ineffective treatments for managing them. That's where the bar is set. Another problem, as Casey pointed out, is that no one in the medical field is trained to step back and look at the big picture anymore. There are over 100 specialties with even more subspecialties, and each of them is designed to maximize the highest number of patients that can be seen each day, since you don't get paid by the quality of your outcomes, but rather based on the volume of people that you see. I can personally testify to the fact that often specialists, despite the undeniable usefulness of their specialties, very often fall into the trap of thinking that their specialty is the only thing that matters, rather than seeing the body as a whole. If they're a bone and joint doctor, they might try to ease your joint pain by prescribing you something that will ruin your liver or increase your chances of getting cancer, which a specialist recommended for me when I was 9 years old. When my mother refused, that doctor told us that if we didn't trust her judgment, the same judgment that would have had me needing a liver transplant before my 20s, and just turn over all decision-making to her, then we needed to find ourselves another specialist. And we did. The whole medical system has been incentivized in such a way that it is the most profitable for the system for each person to see as many specialists as possible. You start out with a primary care doctor. You give him a list of your problems, and you're given 8 or 10 referrals to specialists for each issue. Then you end up spending your entire life in the doctor's office like I have, often without much to show for it in the way of results besides deteriorating health and quality of life. At one point, I was on 30 different prescriptions. That's not 30 pills each day, people. That's 30 different prescriptions, many of which were taken 2 or 3 times per day. I never had any doctors even try to cut back on that, despite the fact that many of the medications were to treat the side effects of other medications. When I finally took matters into my own hands after decades of desperate exhaustion, I was able to drastically cut back, and I am overall in much better health now than I was on all those medications. Both the number of specialists that I was seeing and the number of prescriptions that I was on were the result of well-meaning doctors being trained to stay in their narrow lanes rather than looking at the big picture of how all of these issues are interconnected. None of them looked at me and saw a complete person in a single whole body. Each of them saw their own narrow specialty. My heart, my lungs, my eyes, my joints, my digestive tract, my endocrine system, my immune system, etc. I was a basket of pieces, and that's how the system treats patients, by the piece, rather than as a whole. And the system is growing worse about that. In my experience, young doctors are even more extreme about compartmentalizing your problems into parts than the older doctors are. Specialists are needed, but the system is broken. No one is seeing the forest for the trees. Quote, look at what's happening with kids. We've got ADHD through the roof, autism through the roof. These are neurodevelopmental issues. Then you look at midlife. Women and men are depressed. We have huge rates of mental illness. 25%, a quarter of all women, now are on SSRIs. We're living in the wealthiest, safest country in human history, and 25% of people are on SSRIs. That's insane. Then you go into menopause, and it's sort of brain fog. And then we've got full-blown Alzheimer's going up. So we've got all these neurodevelopmental issues and neurodegenerative issues sort of across the lifespan. Then you look at the hormonal side of things. We've got girls going through puberty much earlier than they ever were. Of continents on Earth, we are the earliest puberty rates. That's gone down on average 6 years since 1900. So girls are reaching sexual maturity at like age 10. In midlife, you look at women, and infertility is through the roof. PCOS is affecting 26% of women. That is a metabolic fertility issue. It's the leading cause of infertility in the country. Then we look at older age, and menopausal symptoms are a disaster for women. This is why a book like The New Menopause was the #1 book in the country for a while, because women are desperate. So if you step back and look at all these different things, we've got these neuro issues throughout the lifetime, all exploding. These hormonal issues throughout the lifetime, all exploding. It's happening all over the place, but no one's stopping and asking, why? Why is this happening? Instead, we put ADHD in a bucket. We put depression and anxiety in a bucket. We put Alzheimer's in a bucket. So that's really the problem. When you think about some of these things, we're becoming infertile and we're losing our minds across the lifespan. Like, what the hell is happening? Casey sees all the apathy about such catastrophic and glaring health issues, not to mention our planetary issues, as a more fundamental spiritual problem. Quote, we are not fighting for life in this world anymore. I think people see it. I think in some way we have totally lost a respect for the miraculousness of life. That's what our actions are reflecting. We know a lot. We have the technology, the money, and the resources to fix all of this, planet and health, and we're not. And that's why I think there's something darker happening on the consciousness level. And I think we could get our way out of this. I think it's going to be hard to get our way out of this if we stick to partisan politics and quibbling about individual policy ideas. I think it has to start with, are we committed to life and to awe and to connecting with Source and then listening and moving our way out of here? Or are we not? And if we choose not, which is what I think we're doing, that's why a lot of people are interested in this issue right now. But if we don't, I do think we're on the road to existential disaster because we're that powerful now. Do we want to believe that life is a miracle? This universe is a miracle. Our bodies are miracles, and we want to connect with God in this lifetime. We want to build and respect these temples that are interconnected with the earth. To do that? Or do we not? And that's the choice we have right now. And I think we have to take that very seriously. And I think a lot of the political stuff that's happening, Maha, it's all just a reflection of people wanting to find a way to fight for life and not knowing how. She explained that, quote, what drives early puberty is excess estrogens. Well, look at our world. Why would we be having extra estrogens? Well, let's look at our environment. The plastics. So we've got plastics, as you know, everywhere. There have been 8 billion metric tons of plastic produced on planet Earth since about 1907, when plastic was commercialized. And the interesting thing about plastic is that when it breaks down, it acts like a xenoestrogen, an exogenous estrogen molecule that can literally bind to our estrogen receptors and act like estrogens. So now we've got plastic effing everywhere. It's literally in the air we're breathing, the nanoparticles. It's in our food. It's in our water. It's in everything. We've now found plastic in every human organ. So of course that's affecting our bodies and our young girls' bodies. It's actually affecting our bodies in utero. There was this recent study that was done that showed 100% of placentas that were dissected had microplastics in them. So that's number one. Number two, look at the pesticides. So there are pesticides where their molecular activity is to increase aromatase, the enzyme that converts testosterone to estrogen. So atrazine, which is banned in Europe, but we spray 70 million pounds of it per year in the U.S., increases aromatase, which converts testosterone to estrogen. Illegal overseas. And we buy it from other countries. So China and Germany and other countries are selling us a chemical of which 70 million pounds are sprayed on our food, invisible and tasteless, which upregulates aromatase and converts testosterone to estrogen. So that's number two. And then you look at just the fat that we have on our bodies. So fat, and especially visceral fat, the metabolically active fat around our midline, actually converts testosterone to estrogen. So we are living in this wildly estrogenic environment that is created by humans. How would you even do the study to show that? And yet, if you put the pieces together, it's very clear. Now go into later life and talking about estrogens. We've got a huge percentage of American women on birth control pills. That's, of course, hopefully post-puberty, but we're putting women on exogenous estrogens for acne, for PCOS, for menstrual irregularity, sometimes, of course, for actual birth control, but it's very ubiquitous now in the environment. And then, of course, it's affecting boys too. So I think about this world we're living in where it's tons of estrogens. It's not like there's a bunch of exogenous testosterones. It's not like the plastics are also simulating testosterone. So you got the estrogens, then we're barreled with sugar. And it's literally like in our kids' school lunches. There's sugar everywhere. sugar is driving the visceral fat in kids, which is turning testosterone to estrogen, which for women, that's going to make puberty early. For men, it's going to feminize them. And then we also have an entire food system that's driving visceral fat to make us more estrogen rich. Like we're living in this estrogen stew that's hard to get away from. By the way, breast cancer, which is also skyrocketing, is estrogen driven. The problem is compounded further in that if these studies were even possible, they're not going to get done because the institutions are all funded by the chemical companies who wouldn't want them to be done. We've become over-dependent on the experts and data when it comes to chronic health conditions and nutrition, to the point where we ignore the blatant conflicts of interest while also ignoring our own common sense. Not ignoring it is somehow kooky. If these chemicals are being used, and no one disputes that they are, and we know that they do these things, and no one disputes that either, then it would make sense that all those chemicals, especially together, would likely be responsible for the rise in the kinds of health conditions that we know would be created by the side effects of these chemicals. Do we really need a double-blind study to tell us what we already know? Do we need a double-blind study to tell us that the sky is blue? We don't need studies for everything in life. We don't need the study that Britain did on a minority of gay men who have pig fetishes. Yes, that's a real thing that the taxpayers were forced to pay for. We don't need a study to find out if milk has a racist, colonial past. That's another real study, one that we paid for, not Britain. Some things we do need studies for. Other things we don't. But it's kind of become the default position that we need studies on everything. We need to pay for studies on everything, and we can't do anything until we have the study. Then the system is designed to make sure that the studies never get done in the first place. Guess what? Studies show that 0.5% of our brain is plastic right now. That's what the latest studies show. Do we really need another study to tell us that that is bad for us? Or can we just move directly to the phase where we figure out how to ingest less plastic? Because I'm kind of for skipping to that phase rather than wasting a decade conducting the study that will tell us what we already know, which is that plastic in our brain is certainly not good for us. Do we really need a study to tell us that an herbicide like glyphosate with links to cancer, which requires you to wear a hazmat suit while you spray it because it kills basically every organism in sight, spraying that on almost all of our food and then eating it is probably bad for us? Come on, guys. Callie is right that just like we've overdivided the medical system, we've overcomplicated every question about every issue to the point that we've completely taken leave of our common sense and tied our own hands when it comes to getting anything real done. We are like Gulliver, tied down with 1,000 thread-like ropes until he can't move anymore. Callie also made another simple point, which is that animals in the wild have no chronic obesity problem. None. Think about it. When have you ever seen an obese animal of any kind ever in the wild? Not your pet, who's also eating unnatural trash foods. I'm talking about in the wild. Even when they live in a plentiful, food-rich environment, none of them are eating themselves into diabetes. That is not how any creature, including human beings, naturally evolved. We didn't evolve to be able to overeat our natural food sources to that degree. It would be virtually impossible to become obese on homegrown vegetables and fresh grass-fed meats, no matter how much of them you ate. Obesity was almost non-existent for our species, just like all the rest of them, up until very, very recently. Why did we all suddenly develop that big of a loss of self-control at the same time, the entire species, without any environmental factors playing into that? Or is something else going on? Do 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 do. Changes can be made when enough people get involved, as Vani Hari has repeatedly proved. She recently met with Kellogg's, asking them to take out some of these chemicals that have links to autoimmune diseases, cancers, asthma, etc. These healthier versions of their products already exist because that's what they sell to Australia and Europe, minus the chemicals. But for no real reason, they still put those chemicals in the food that American kids are eating. Kellogg's got a lot of positive press back in 2018 when they promised to remove these chemicals from our food too. But 6 years later, they still haven't actually done it, even though they already make the safer product. Why are American food companies willing to go to the trouble and expense to make food safe for other countries, but they won't make safe food for their own people? And why are we allowing that choice to be optional for them? When Europe and Australia found out that these chemicals weren't safe, the food companies fixed their products for these countries. So why didn't they just fix their products for everyone rather than continuing to make a separate version that they know is harming people for us? Just one example. Food dyes. Red number 3 was banned in cosmetics here in the U.S. because it caused cancer. It gives you cancer just to wear it in your makeup. But it was left in our food because alcohol companies lobbied to keep it there on the grounds that it made the maraschino cherries in cocktails and on ice creams a pretty red color. Doesn't improve the taste, just makes it visually more pretty, which is worth giving people cancer? The American Council of Science and Health takes money from Kellogg's, Coke, Bear, McDonald's, etc., just to exist and sound reputable, and then assassinates the character of anyone trying to spread the info about how dangerous these things are. Vanny succeeded in getting a horrible chemical used for purely cosmetic reasons out of most breads. But she's not done, so they've been targeting her. USAID tracked her address and phone numbers, her parents' information, etc., to dox and endanger her, even though she was already receiving death threats and rape threats because of the many articles demonizing her for speaking out. And the USAID was using government funding to do this kind of targeting. McDonald's uses a chemical in the oil for their fries and in their Diet Coke fountain drinks that is the main ingredient in silly putty. But McDonald's doesn't use that chemical in their franchises in other countries. No. Australia's McDonald's serves real grass-fed beef. not the garbage we get here. I could go on, but I would just recommend that you watch Vanny's interview with my favorite podcaster, Chris Williamson. He's a Brit who's been living in Austin, Texas for the last couple of years. Health-conscious guy. Bit of a fitness nut. By the way, he eats the same way that he has throughout his adult life. The only change is that now he's eating the American versions of his food. And he's developed all kinds of autoimmune gut issues since moving here, which he says is a common problem for immigrants. But back to the mean siblings. Quote, "The problem is we've been lied to by the professors at Harvard, at Stanford, at Tufts Nutrition School that I believe are essentially, from my experience, PR for the food industry and the pharmaceutical industry that accepts all these things as a given. I mean, Tufts Nutrition School, 80% of their budget is from food companies. By our estimate, 50% of Stanford Medical School's budget somehow touches pharma. So just fundamentally, on the grassroots micro level, these industries have co-opted our institutions of trust. And you ask why we're the only people speaking out? Because we've made it so that evidence-based medicine really accepts all this disease growing and happening. And 95% of medical spending right now is on disease once it's happened. It's on managing conditions. And there's no higher levels of trust in our society than the NIH, than the FDA, than Harvard Med School, than Stanford Med School. So all of them are enforcing this. And then it's really interesting where their emphasis is. I was reading just the other day that California, the medical board, is checking the licenses of doctors, putting them under review if they write 5 vaccine exception notes. You literally are like on the verge of losing your license if you go outside the orthodoxy on vaccines. But where is that level of emphasis? Where is that level of focus? Where is that level of rigor around metabolic health for kids? Around nutrition for kids? I think it's a big deal, kids getting polio, but like 50% of teens are obese or overweight right now. We have pre-diabetes skyrocketing. The medical system knows how to focus on something. They know how to tell Congress when there's no cost too high for something. When it comes to pharmaceutical interventions, we're bankrupting the country with interventions once people get sick. We can change this really quickly. The issue is that the interests that profit from us being in fear, just fundamentally as a statement of economic fact, profit from us being sick, profit from us being depressed, profit from us being infertile. They have co-opted our institutions of trust, and they have co-opted the clinical guidelines. Like literally, when I was a junior employee, I helped Coke funnel money to the American Diabetes Association. The American Diabetes Association says that if you have diabetes, you don't need to worry about your sugar intake. They say it's not tied to food. The American Academy of Pediatrics right now is saying that if your child is a slightly overweight 12-year-old, it says, do not wait to see if dietary interventions work. Ozempic. It's now being studied on 6-year-olds. The American Psychiatry Association, the standard of care, if your child is a little sad, SSRI, immediate intervention. SSRI rates have doubled among high schoolers in the past 5 years. If your child's a little fidgety, the standard of care is not asking whether they're in the sunlight. It's not asking if they're too sedentary. Not asking if they're being force-fed, ultra-processed food, which would make any animal crazy if we subjected them to what kids are subjected to. No discussion of that. It's just not in the clinical guidelines. So these doctors, These good people like Casey go into this medical system, but they come in and they get saddled with one skill. They get saddled with a bunch of debt, and then they're realizing this is a rigged system. A few people, unfortunately, had the courage, like Casey, to drop out. I thought she was an idiot. I was like, what are you doing? We were kind of brainwashed to do the traditional system. I couldn't believe it. We didn't talk for a year. And the way you rise up in medicine is you do a specialty. You focus on a couple inches of the face. Anything that's not siloed is considered not scientific, is considered wacky. They've called us the woo-woo caucus, talking about nutrition. The medical system enforces this siloed view where diabetes, heart disease, depression, kidney disease, cancer, they're all separate things. If you have those conditions, you're seeing 5 separate doctors. They aren't speaking to each other. That's very profitable, but very problematic. 90% of the U.S. medical budget is tied to managing preventable and reversible lifestyle conditions. If we had people on Medicaid, instead of jamming them with the statins, jamming them with Ozempic, jamming them with SSRIs, lower income people who are going bankrupt from Medicaid, $1.3 trillion, it's a bigger part of the budget than the defense budget. If we literally just ask, how do we have that money to spur thriving, to incentivize exercise, to incentivize healthier food for these folks, we'd be a transformed country. It's literally that simple. But it takes that moral courage. It takes Americans actually saying, no, I am going to go against the NIH. I am going to ask questions. I was just reading back in 2022 when every single public health official in America said that you, meaning Rogan, were like enemy number one for talking about sunlight and talking about food and talking about healthy eating. COVID was a metabolic condition. Like if you were metabolically healthy, you did not die of COVID. Like pretty demonstrably. And you were threat number one? Casey insists that a lot of doctors and nurses are speaking out. But like most things in our society right now, this subject is very tribal. We know that it's hardwired into us on a primal level not to go against whatever is the norm from our pack. So changing this really will come down to a matter of how courageous people are willing to be. Are we going to simply let this happen to us and to our loved ones and to our children? Or are we going to go against the grain and put a stop to it? Quote, when I was in medical school, Stanford got a $3 million grant from Pfizer while I was there to revamp the curriculum. And the fact that the American Diabetes Association that makes clinical guidelines is getting millions of dollars from Coke and Cadbury, and the American Diabetes Association is getting millions of dollars from Mead Johnson that makes formula, and Abbott Nutrition that makes formula, and vaccine companies that make flu vaccines. 8,000 major conflicts of interest were just reported at the NIH with food and pharma. So at every level, the medical guidelines that if you step out of, you are at risk for litigation as a doctor. And the NIH, this thing that we all respect, has tons of conflicts of interest. And the medical schools accepting money, the tribe that then you become a part of as a trainee is a tribe that only hears one thing. So I have a lot of compassion for doctors because I did go through the medical school and not learn any of the things that I had to learn after. I learned about basically organ-specific physiology, pharmacology, and then in residency, I learned how to do surgery. And then, of course, throughout the whole thing, I learned how to bill. But ultimately, those are not the tools that generate foundational cellular health. 80% of medical schools in the United States don't require a single nutrition course. Not 1 minute of nutrition. Yet 90% of our health care costs are tied to diseases. The things that are torturing American lives are tied to food. And doctors, it's not a hammer in our toolbox. I didn't learn at Stanford Medical School that 95% of the people on the USDA Food Guidelines for America Committee had conflicts of interest with the food industry. I didn't learn that there were 8,000 conflicts of interest at the NIH. I didn't learn that there were 8 billion tons of plastic on planet Earth that are degrading into estrogen analogs. I did not learn that there's 6 billion pounds of pesticides sprayed on our global food supply every single year, most from China and Germany, and that these are literally tied very strongly to Alzheimer's, dementia, cancer, obesity, mitochondrial dysfunction, infertility, ADHD, liver dysfunction. And I didn't learn that simply taking 7,000 steps per day can slash your risk of obesity, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, dementia, even gastric reflux by 40 to 60%. And the average American is walking 3,500 steps per day. We're literally just not moving as a country. And if you just walk a little bit, 7,000 steps, which takes like 45 minutes, you slash your risk of every major chronic disease. I didn't learn that we need to be getting sunlight because our circadian biology dictates our cellular health. We are diurnal animals that have biological processes that happen during the day and other biological processes that happen at night. And the way your body knows whether it's day or night is if you get photons hitting your retinas and your skin cells. Pretty basic, pretty foundational for human health. I didn't learn anything about it. Didn't learn anything about sunlight. Didn't learn anything about photons. Didn't learn anything about sleep. We're sleeping 20% less on average than we were 100 years ago, and sleep is a huge risk factor. You can, in an experimental setting, take a young, healthy person and subject them to sleep deprivation for 5 nights, and they become pre-diabetic. Well, 50% of Americans are pre-diabetic and type 2 diabetic, and we're not sleeping well. And I didn't learn not 1 minute on sleep, and so many more. And of course, nothing about nutrition. I certainly didn't learn that medical error and medication is the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States. I learned that patient comes in and I need to label their diagnosis and give them a pill. So when I speak of the tribalism, I have so much compassion for doctors who feel stuck right now. They're stuck in a broken system. The tribe that they're a part of has taught them a certain set of things. There are trillions of dollars of interest to make the things they learn specific, myopic lenses. And putting together dots is risky because if you step outside of the guidelines, you're at risk for intense litigation and potentially ridicule. I mean, I'm called pseudoscientific, alt-right, woo-woo caucus all the time. We need to sit down every morning and decide what we want for the future. What do we want? We're all players. We're all important. We all need to use our voices. What future do we want, and what are we willing to do for it? Get our priorities straight. Is our priority our house and our mortgage and our boat and our comfortable life that's killing us? Or is it to elevate, to be stewards of the future and of the planet, and to make some harder choices? This tribe on the other side that I think we're all in, of promoting health, is beautiful. And people are really healthy and happy. And it's not that hard, and it's not that expensive. And everyone is welcome here in this tribe of trying to move humanity towards a more harmonious future. Everyone is welcome. It's bipartisan. It's about team humanity. And team humanity always, by extension, will be team planet because they're interconnected. So I think we need to break out of that past of tribalism and really realize we need to be brave. We need to be courageous. We need to fight for life And it's pretty bright and wonderful when we start doing that. Unless you grew up with health problems like me and have extensive experience with the medical system, which would have led you to know that there are both good doctors and bad doctors, both of which are mortal and often make mistakes, then COVID was really the first time that most people had their absolute faith in doctors and the medical system shaken. They saw all of the contradictory videos of Fauci and lost a lot of their faith in the NIH. Callie says that leaving the conspiracies aside, there are a few really important dates for some historical context. Quote, the first was 1909, the Flexner Report. So literally, John D. Rockefeller's personal lawyer wrote the report for Congress. That's the standards for today for medical education. And it literally says in the binding guidelines that holistic health and nutrition and anything about the interconnectedness of the body is pseudoscience. It says we need to name the condition and cut it out or prescribe it. Rescinding the Flexner Report and having updated scientific education and standard of care guidelines based on what we've learned since 1909 about the majesty of the interconnectedness of our body is a really good first start. John D. Rockefeller's personal lawyer wrote this report. Why? Because John D. Rockefeller is the father of the pharmaceutical industry and was the first investor in the Johns Hopkins and other major medical schools, and started the modern education program for health. There were some big issues in health. This was the Wild West. But he created Johns Hopkins and the standards of residency training as a way to silo diseases very intentionally, and then prescribed his products and inventions as the top pharmaceutical maker. The medical schools that he created were basically a distribution system to him. So you get to World War II. I would argue almost any medical miracle you can think of was created before that time. It's all acute situations. Emergency surgical procedures, sanitation procedures, antibiotics to make an infection not deadly. Almost every medical miracle we can think of was something that was going to kill you right away. Infectious disease. And then you take the pill or take the treatment for a finite time and you stop it. Or you do the surgery quickly and you're cured. Those are medical miracles, and we had a lot of good things happen up until World War II. Very intentionally, the medical industry saw the birth control pill in the late 1950s, 1960s, and the birth control pill was the first pill in history that people took for longer than a couple of weeks. It was the first pill ever that, oh, interesting. You can actually convince someone to take a pill for years, for almost most of their life. Recurring revenue. And there was a huge emphasis of the medical industry to take the trust engendered up until 1960. All medicine was acute issues, chronic disease, diabetes, obesity. That was outside the doctor's office. Then they saw you could medicalize chronic conditions. Today, 90 to 95% of spending is on chronic conditions. In the 1970s, literally the Sackler family, their grandkids and kids did the opioids. Their forebears created Valium. And 30% of women in the United States in the 1970s were on Valium. Time magazines, Valium Nation, Mommy's Little Helper. So we started creating all these psychiatric conditions. We started medicalizing heart disease, started medicalizing type 2 diabetes, started creating academic research totally funded by the pharmaceutical industry, saying that type 2 diabetes isn't reversible. It's basically genetic. Heart disease, all of these things, and started pilling them. Then what happened to food? Chronic disease wasn't that big of a deal in the 1970s and 80s. You look at the graph of all chronic conditions, there's just a sharp turn in the 80s. It's literally almost to the year of the Surgeon General's report saying that smoking wasn't great. So the second that report came out, Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds were two of the largest companies in the world. It wasn't Microsoft and Google on the top companies list. It was cigarette companies. They used their cash piles, and by 1990, the three largest M&A deals in world history, meaning mergers and acquisitions, were cigarette companies buying food companies. So you had Nabisco, bought by R.J. Reynolds. You had Kraft and U.S. Food. And you see those graphs of all the food companies owned by like a couple companies? That was the cigarette companies. And they did two things very, very intentionally. They took over the institutions of trust to say ultra-processed food was healthy. And then they took their scientists and rigged the food itself to make it more addictive. Not to kill kids, but to make it more addictive. So you had the literal food pyramid, which said ultra-processed food is great, low-fat, carb base on the pyramid. That was constructed literally by the cigarette industry to promote their addictive products. And this weaponization of food, as I call it, it's not just this conspiracy. Literally, the cigarette industry, those two companies, Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds, were the two largest food producers in the United States. Like 50% of American foods were created by cigarette companies in the 1990s. And they have got us addicted and weaponized this food, and all chronic conditions have just shot up. It's because that ultra-processed food is literally, by tobacco industry scientists, hijacks our evolutionary biology. Again, you can't overeat grass-fed steak. They're shutting off our satiety signals. The byproducts of this cheap addictive food, which we don't even have research for yet, is that it's sprayed with 10,000 chemicals that are allowed in the United States when only 400 are allowed in Europe. All these chemicals to make the food addictive, to make the food cheap, and to do the monocropping. These chemicals, these neurotoxins, are destroying our cells in ways that we don't fully understand. And it can be undone pretty quickly, too. But we have to realize that this isn't a conspiracy. It's true corruption that happened deliberately. Casey pointed out that we are one of the only countries in the world where the burden of proof for these chemicals is on the harm side. In other countries, you have to prove a chemical is safe before you can put it on people's food. Here, you have to prove it is harmful before you can make them stop putting it on the food. Which is why only 400 chemicals that have been proven to be safe are approved in Europe. And 10,000 chemicals that may or may not be safe are regularly used here. Generally regarded as safe designations means that the company is self-assessing whether the chemical that they created and they want to use are safe. No one from the outside, no third party regulates this at all unless later on proof arises that it has already done harm to people. The Monsanto papers about Roundup causing non-Hodgkin's lymphoma came about because ghostwritten papers claiming that glyphosate was safe under this self-regulation were exposed as false. This eventually forced all the related info to be declassified. Doing studies on these chemicals is not only a waste of time, a waste of resources, and a waste of money, all to tell us what common sense already tells us. If companies want to keep on using them, then they should pay for the studies to prove that they are safe and be forced to stop using them in the meantime. And because so much of the damage is caused from the combinations of these chemicals, there would be virtually no way to do these studies because, by design, they insist that you look at one factor at a time. That should be their problem to sort out. We simply need to move to the European standard of proving that a chemical is safe before it can be used. Start with the 400 chemicals that Europe allows, and anyone who wants to use something beyond that needs to prove that it's safe first, not make us prove that it isn't. Just change the rules. We can't afford to wait a decade for an NIH study run by people that we already know are corrupted through conflicts of interest. Based on the rates of these diseases and the crippling costs to the healthcare system, we need a reset now. Casey says that ultra-processed foods really didn't exist before World War II. We needed stable foods with a long shelf life that could be produced for the troops. And then the potential for profit was seen. The feminist movement was hijacked to convince people that switching to ultra-processed food was actually liberating women who would no longer be trapped in the kitchen preparing meals from scratch. Instead, there was the easy, quick solution that was never meant to be consumed for an entire lifetime. Quote, 67% of children's calories are now ultra-processed food. This means food that comes from a factory made by food scientists, not just processed, ultra-processed, the highest form of processing. 67% of calories. That's 2/3, people. Then you go to the 1970s, and we have the advent of high fructose corn syrup. Basically, food scientists used an understanding about hibernating animals like bears. Fructose is one of the only types of calories where instead of making you feel satiated or full, it makes you feel more hungry. And this is evolutionarily in the fall when animals are prepping for hibernation and start eating fructose-rich berries. They need to put on a ton of fat for winter. It actually gets the bears to be hungry and even violent to outcompete the other animals to get as many berries as possible in a short period of time to 3D print fat for winter. So you have the scientists understanding this and say, hey, we can make liquid fructose 1,000 times more potent than the fructose you would find in berries. Same molecule, but in higher concentration, and we can add it to everything. We can add it to salad dressing. We're going to add it to ketchup. We're going to add it to children's school lunches. We're going to add it, obviously, to sodas. And we're going to make people insatiable. We're going to make their bodies and their brains think that they're preparing for winter that's never coming. And there has been research that shows that high fructose corn syrup is associated with violence, ADHD in kids, all these different things. Flash forward in 1986, which is the date when litigation went through that said we couldn't sue vaccine manufacturers. That's a very important date in the whole history because it is one of the first times that we were able to pass legislation through Congress that said that pharmaceutical companies could not be sued for wrongdoing. And that still is present today. They basically put together a paltry little fund that people could apply to get no-fault reimbursement for vaccine harm, but you cannot sue the company. So you start to get companies being legally immune from wrongdoing, which is then accelerated. And they're now starting to try and push things like that for pesticides as well. So that's just some of the history of why we are where we are today. It's not rocket science. This has all been very institutionalized and structured, and it's the last 50 years. We can undo all of this with leadership. Returning to high fructose corn syrup, she said, so when fructose is metabolized in the body, not like glucose, it creates uric acid, which creates oxidative stress and mitochondrial dysfunction. If you have mitochondrial dysfunction, you're not going to be able to process sugars to energy. So you break the mitochondria with excess fructose, overloading the mitochondria with uric acid, and then what happens? You can't turn sugars into energy. So what do? You turn sugars into fat. And on top of that, the mitochondrial dysfunction and oxidative stress happening in the brain is what may inspire the violence and the ADHD and all that stuff to make the bears manic so they can get as much berries as possible. This is what's happening to every kid in every classroom in America right now. We have the ability to clear uric acid, and we have the ability to process fructose in physiological amounts. We're never going to have the uric acid increasing and overloading the mitochondria if we're eating an apple. It's when you're eating 20 to 30 times the fructose that an apple has, and you're literally drinking, pouring it down. All of a sudden, imagine you get this huge rise in uric acid in the body and other things that are happening, and that's when it overwhelms. It's a bit of that dose makes the poison. Because our body has the ability to excrete toxins. Our body has the ability to deal with some heavy metals. Our body has the ability to probably clear some level of glyphosate. But we can't clear all of it, all the time, 24 hours a day, in 100 times the quantity of all these things together. The research in this cult of the science, they love to ignore that the synergistic effects of this overwhelming our cellular resources is just conveniently forgotten. Because we study things in isolation. That's literally the definition of how a double-blind, placebo-controlled study happens. It's one thing that you're testing. That doesn't make sense. We live in a toxic stew. It's like with vaccines. Yeah, I bet that one vaccine probably isn't causing autism. But what about the 20 that they're getting before 18 months? Like, we don't look at it in synergistic. So that's a big problem. And this is where the cult of the science is beautiful. Using the scientific method and using that way of inquiry into the natural world is a beautiful art. But weaponizing papers that are often bought for or corrupted, and the leaders of some of our key medical journals have actually even said that 50% of scientific research that's published ends up being wrong. So it's bought for, corrupted, or wrong. We rely on this. And one interesting trend that we're seeing in our world is that if we do choose to put dots together or use our God-given intuition, anything other than this particular way of examining things, you are dangerous. And I think that is something we need to really question, especially as a woman. I have the ability in my body to build a human, 3D print a human. I don't need a peer-reviewed study or a textbook to tell me how to do that. We've now been told that you can't trust it, and you are dangerous if you do that. And I think that's one of the reasons that parents are very frustrated right now. We're being told now that parents are the enemy for using their own judgment about their families and their kids. That's deeply frustrating to people. That's basically what we're being asked to do. This year, in 2024, is the highest rates in American history of Alzheimer's, cancer, autoimmune conditions, heart disease, diabetes, kidney disease, autism. Every single chronic disease you can think of is at an all-time high, growing at an increasing rate as we spend more money to treat those conditions. How do we find marginal pills to make this a little bit better? Not asking why. When it comes to chronic conditions, which Alzheimer's is, you have to ask why that's one branch on this tree of obesity. You can literally look at 5 biomarkers: HDL, triglycerides, blood sugar, blood pressure, and your waistline. I'm not being hyperbolic. If we fired every single researcher and canceled every single grant in the U.S. government for all chronic disease research and all nutrition research and created all policy to maximize those 5 biomarkers in America, you by definition don't have type 2 diabetes. You have almost 0% chance of getting heart disease. You have very close to 0% chance of getting Alzheimer's. You are not obese by definition. Literally, you go down every single chronic condition that is torturing American life. If you're diabetic, you're 4 times more likely to be depressed or suicidal because there are cells in your head, and diabetes is cellular dysregulation. Chronic disease is interconnected to basic lifestyle factors. I think this is a political issue, honestly. Every American needs to ask, is this an incremental issue where we need slightly better pharmaceutical interventions and slightly better research? Or is this a radical shift of understanding how our bodies are interconnected and understanding that needs to be a shift in medicine and, frankly, how we view the environment? That is a question that we actually think is relatively urgent and relatively existential. We're growing 2 times with healthcare spending the rate of GDP, which is the income created from goods and services. Healthcare costs are growing at double the rate of our income. Continuing with this quote, it's the largest and fastest growing industry in the country. The fastest growing industry in the United States is not AI. It's not tech. It's healthcare. And as it grows, we get sicker, fatter, more depressed, more infertile. It is going to bankrupt the country, and it is not slowing down. So if you actually believe this, is it about getting better research? Or is it about actually saying the research is wrong? This whole paradigm of seeing chronic disease in silos is wrong. It's interconnected. When it comes to Alzheimer's, Casey said, we've somehow decided to separate the brain from the body as if they're different things, when in fact they're all just made of cells that do the same things. We've got 50% of Americans with prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, which is fundamentally a metabolic issue. The brain's basically underpowered. It's not getting the energy it needs, and that's going to express itself as dementia. It's been increasing in parallel with everything that's happening with our increasing diabetes rates. And then the early onset in dementia and Alzheimer's disease. That has tripled since 2013. That makes sense, though. We've got 30%, or a third of teens now pre-diabetic. That was like 0% in the past. So you've got now 30% of teens with prediabetes. You've got middle-aged people now 50% with prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. Maybe with these cells crying out for help, maybe some of these plaques that we're seeing are the brain actually laying down protective shielding. It's a response to an underlying metabolic issue as opposed to the problem itself. But we're like, we just got to get rid of that symptom of the problem. When in fact, if we could unencumber the brain to be able to make energy properly, would actually be able to heal itself and to have the power to do its work, which is cognitive thinking. When you really look at the research, there are about 36 different biomarkers and factors, 36 holes in the roof. If it's raining and you plug one hole, your house is still going to be filled with water. You have to plug all 36 holes to prevent or reverse Alzheimer's disease. All of these are related in some way to metabolic health, but it's things like your vitamin D levels, your insulin levels, the amount of movement you're getting, B12, other things like that. These things that we know are part and parcel with metabolic health. And there was an amazing Lancet paper from a couple of years ago that showed that if we just got on top of some of the basic modifiable factors of our metabolic health, we could slash Alzheimer's rates from happening. Fundamentally, it's one more branch on the tree that is rooted in this metabolic dysfunction in our body, which is fundamentally rooted in three processes that really hurt the brain, which is oxidative stress, mitochondrial dysfunction, and chronic inflammation. These are the three hallmarks of metabolic dysfunction, and the brain is so sensitive and such a complex, high-processing power organ. But these core cellular disturbances that make up metabolic dysfunction, which are caused by our environment and cannot really be addressed with drugs, mitochondrial dysfunction, oxidative stress, chronic inflammation, they're showing up so prominently in the brain. The real question that we've somehow overlooked is Alzheimer's skyrocketing because we don't have enough drugs and research? A lack of pills and papers is why people are getting this disease at alarming rates like never before? A biological need for pills is causing people's brains to shut down like some weird pill malnourishment? That's our theory. Is the reason obesity rates are skyrocketing among kids also because of this deficit? We evolved with a biological need for Ozempic that isn't being met because we don't have enough drugs and research. They didn't have more drugs and research in the past, and it wasn't a problem for them. So this isn't a medication deficit problem. Yet that is fundamentally the argument that's being given to us and accepted by us. Quote, because we trust the medical system still so much, we are literally thinking societally that the fact that there's an obesity crisis among 6-year-olds is a drug deficiency issue. It's a dark blind spot in our culture right now. End quote. And we accept this despite a string of well-respected researchers having recently been exposed for unbelievable corruption in their so-called findings on a variety of topics, including Alzheimer's. There are instances where they have completely made up data that has then served as the foundations for future research. Recent headlines ran, quote, over 100 NIH-funded Alzheimer's and Parkinson's research papers contained completely made-up data, according to new allegations. Billions in funding and years of research are now in serious doubt, end quote. The ripple effects are truly unimaginable, all with no real consequences, not even a widespread loss of credibility. How is it possible that we had no reaction to that news? Maybe we would have if our brains were functioning fully. We saw this recently with SSRIs too, that a lot of the data was complete BS. Then there's instances where studies whose results activists didn't like were hidden from the public. Like the study that wasn't made available even though they knew what it showed, because it showed that puberty blockers made absolutely no improvement among minors suffering from gender dysphoria. All the economic incentives right now work against us getting better results than this. Every industry fights to maximize economic growth, including the medical industry, down to the NIH and their medical researchers. They're human beings too, which means they're motivated by money. That carrot all of us chase, including them. The blindness of our politicians is another huge obstacle. Callie recalled sitting with a member of Congress who introduced the Obesity Act, which has 130 co-sponsors and is seeking to pass government funding for Ozempic, starting with Medicare, which will spread to Medicaid because if old people, 80% of which are obese, 4/5, get access to this medication, how can you deny it to poor people? This, combined with the guidelines for giving Ozempic to children as young as 6, would result in a lot of lower-income children being put on this drug. It costs $1,600 per patient every month, which will require a lot of taxpayer dollars to pay for this bill. Ozempic is made by Novo Nordisk, which is the 9th most valuable company in the world. It also is the owner of the most valuable company in Europe, and 90% of their profit projections are what they expect to make off of selling Ozempic to Americans when this bill passes. Callie brought up these issues to Brad Winstrup of Ohio, who was introducing the bill. Why are we funding this expensive and unnatural drug, which won't fix all the other health problems created by these toxins, instead of using all of that money to fund better food and to pay for gym memberships to incentivize healthier lifestyles that would help more than just weight issues? Why would using the intervention of drugs be the first and only cure for every problem at every age? The congressman's response to Callie's reasonable question was, I never thought of that. Callie told him about the aggressive efforts to push this drug on kids, how the top obesity researchers and experts at Stanford and Harvard were funded by the company who makes Ozempic, who gave them millions of dollars in research grants, and how the researchers then went on 60 Minutes, whose top advertisers are pharmaceutical companies, and said that obesity was genetic and a quote-unquote brain disease, which requires aggressive medical intervention even for kids. Congressman Winstrup didn't even know that the bill he was pushing would make the drug available to kids. He said that he would put it in the bill that kids would not have access to the drug. But Callie pointed out to him that since that would go against the FDA guidelines, if he passes the bill to make the drug widely available, he wouldn't have the option to overrule the FDA guidelines about who should take it. This is about money and the problems it creates. You can watch the video of a J.P. Morgan conference in San Francisco when the chart was displayed showing that as Ozempic increases in prescription rates, obesity in the United States will likewise increase. And all of the investors clapped enthusiastically at that prospect, giving a standing ovation. It's a lifetime drug that bottles a crash diet. It's liquid anorexia. It makes you feel too queasy to eat. So it doesn't work long term any more than crash diets do. More than half of the people who get their insurance to cover it choose to go off of it within 6 months because it's got the highest rate of side effects of any mass drug prescribed in American history, according to Callie. Congressman Winstrup, who is working to get funding for this drug via proposing one of the most expensive bills in American history, knew nothing about any of this. He even told Callie that he thought Ozempic was a short-term drug, meant to get people to a healthy weight and then they could come off of it. Ozempic itself says that you can never come off the drug. It says on the warning label that there are metabolic issues that result from coming off of it, and that you have to take it for life. He didn't know that. Yet he was leading the charge to push the bill through Congress. That unstoppable system rolling along mostly unaware of the damage being caused by it is exactly how we got here. It's the frog in the boiling water. People are so used to assuming that the answer to every problem is to find a drug, rather than ask, why is this problem occurring at suddenly skyrocketing rates in the first place, when it never did in the past? What changed? What caused this? For example, why didn't Fauci tell us in 2022 that COVID had strong metabolic links and we needed to strengthen our immune systems to combat it so that it would be much less likely to prove fatal? We were dying at 3 times the rate per capita as the Japanese were. 16% of all COVID deaths were in the U.S., and we only have 4% of the world's population. Meaning, under Fauci, we had 4 times as many deaths than we should have. That's indisputable by the numbers. Our immune systems are crashing on every front as a result of being overloaded with these toxins, and we need to shift our focus to getting healthy again, not to making more drugs. You'll never get out in front of the problem that way. We need to help regenerative farmers grow healthy crops that don't destroy our soil. We need to quit spraying pesticides that are in 60% of our water supply. We need an FDA that operates exclusively on government funding, not on funding from the people it's then supposed to regulate in the pharma industry. Food needs to be tested by third parties for safety, not be self-regulating. We need to pass laws that forbid these corrupt conflicts of interest. There's a lot to do, but it's all simple, common sense stuff, and we can't afford to wait any longer. Quote, the medical system has co-opted what drugs are and what medicine is. It's nothing short of a moral blind spot that food and exercise aren't seen truly as drugs. They do that in Europe. The Italians are 3 times less obese and diabetic than us. And I would just insert here, Italians live to eat carbs. I know, I'm Sicilian. And yet they don't have an obesity problem. And by the way, a lot of people who believe that they have a gluten intolerance don't have any problem with eating the pasta in Italy, because their grain isn't covered in these pesticides. Continuing with the quote, I don't think the Italians are more vigorous. I don't think Americans are lazier than Italians. There's something systemic happening. They spend 3 times less per capita on healthcare and 2 times more per capita on food, and they're living 8 years longer. End quote. Why aren't we doing that if their results are better than ours? Callie says there is bipartisan support for this issue. He has not only talked to Trump and RFK, but to Nancy Pelosi and 40 other members of Congress. The problem, according to him, is that so many of them have staffers slithering behind them who know that their next job will be with the pharma industry or the insurance industry, and these unelected bureaucrats are really the people who write the bills and drive the machine forward. The institutions have been taken over. The FDA gets 75% of its funding from pharma, which it's supposed to be regulating. And the people who sit as chairs on healthcare committees fundamentally do not understand what the problem is or any of the statistics showing how severe it is. It is a complete blind spot in their vision. A lot of them had never even heard any of this information until Callie presented it to them. But the public is becoming aware of it. That's why people are buying the books and why there are millions of views for these podcasts. But we have to insist that the politicians channel their energy and attention into these issues in order to have some real changes made. We've only been guaranteed 4 years, people. Chop, chop. We, the people, are feeling frustrated and trapped by a system that has been rigged and never goes anywhere. And those people are desperate for change. So they were willing to back any politician that was willing to give it to them, rather than gaslight them about there being no problem at all. Most of us want our leaders to set aside their differences. unbury themselves from their political trenches, set aside their personal feelings, transcend what has been going on between the parties, and start getting stuff done instead of pointing fingers and grandstanding. Callie has done that. He, like many, including myself, used to be a firm never-Trumper. But out of the two options we were given recently, and their respective track records, Trump was the one doing more listening to people like me. And he was more focused on the real issues affecting the little people than the other side was, as they focused on equity and trans surgeries for illegal immigrants in prison, and on cheering on genocidal Nazi terrorists like Hamas. So when Trump brought on RFK, I decided to believe that all of the listening was not just for show. This was for real, and it gave me hope. The first hope I had felt in a while. A hope that was confirmed when Trump followed through on nominating RFK to be the new Secretary of Health and Human Services. Yes, Trump says things that I don't always like. But he also sees the corruption, admits that there is an existential problem, and he's willing to ignore the blowback to take it on rather than appease it, by appointing people like Elon Musk and RFK to get something done for a change. And I don't believe that he will stand in their way or tie their hands like so many others in Washington do. He will let them do their thing despite the wailing and gnashing of teeth hysterics that have already ensued in the face of real change. There is no choice here. If we don't fix the problems around these wars, around our health, around agriculture, which needs to become regenerative, in education that needs to be educational for a change, in censorship and AI, etc., in immigration, which needs to become sane and safe, and on our terms, because it's our country, our home, or we will collapse based purely off of the numbers, even before bringing morality or ideologies into it, just based on the economics of it all. We don't have the option of waiting for slow incremental changes. We are already on the precipice, and that's why a lot of people believe that only someone who existed outside of the system had a chance of seeing the forest for the trees. The system just churns out the same old uniform scripts, the same lack of results, the endless gaslighting lies, then expects the same level of trust from us, even when they've been caught repeatedly lying to our faces, which they seem to think they can go on doing without anything changing. They expect people to just go along with them unquestioningly on a permanent basis. No! Things must change. And they won't unless we demand it. With their massive blind spots, they don't even seem to understand that this is why independent media has become the most listened to form of media. They rail against it, but never once do they really ask why. They say it's because people aren't engaged, they only want to watch short clips, ignoring the fact that Rogan's podcast has more views than anyone else I know, and it's usually 2 to 3 hours long. They're simply infuriated that they can't scold or gaslight people into trusting them, no matter how much they destroy that trust. And they go right on making up, Trump threatened to put Liz Cheney in front of a firing squad stories, with the tapes of what he actually said out there for anyone to see, which show him saying that if she was so eager to start wars, she should try being the one on the front lines for a change. He even said, with a gun in her hands. How many people get sent to firing squads armed by their executioners? All they end up accomplishing is to destroy their own credibility. But just like addicts, they can't stop. If we allow them to take our voices and censor us into silence on the issues we face, then all hope will truly be lost, and they will try. Look at the way they went after YouTube to censor the Daily Wire in the last week of the election. We have to be able to discuss ideas and information freely. It is our most fundamental right to do so. Look at how coordinated their aggressions against Elon Musk have been since he took over Twitter and broke their stranglehold. Free speech is a true threat to their ability to hold on to the power that they have had for so long, and the money that power generates. The danger in allowing 50% of the news advertisements to be dependent on pharma, along with a big chunk of the main platform's ads and tech companies' ads to be from pharma, isn't that common people are bombarded with ads from medications. The problem is that all of those powerful institutions are then dependent on pharma and their lobbyists and can't afford to lose them. And that dictates what they report and what they don't, as well as their political spins on everything else. And all of the complications just spiral out from there. Then when you have the universities and researchers like Harvard and the NIH also funded by pharma and ultra-processed food, the studies will reflect what the guy paying the bills wants them to. That's just human nature. That's how you end up with the NIH telling people that Lucky Charms are healthier for them than beef is with a straight face. Even a politician who wants to make changes and take these unhealthy foods off the school lunch program is forced to try to go against a study, against the science. If he suggests that feeding kids natural, farm-fresh eggs for breakfast would be better than feeding them Lucky Charms, he's the quack because he's not an expert. Everybody defers to these self-proclaimed, incestuously appointed experts who are part of an institution which is dependent on their funders, who come from these corrupt and conflicted industries, all using their money and their lobbyists to insulate themselves from the consequences of poisoning people for more money. They've tied up the system with a billion little threads like Gulliver until no one can move, and it's time to blow it all up and sweep it all away, or they will see to it that we never get the chance again. The importance of this really cannot be overstated. It is compromising what becomes the standards of care that doctors have to follow. And there are people who understand that. You see it in the massive political shifts and the resulting realignments that are truly unprecedented in modern politics. The media tries to malign it, mock it, and demonize it, but the problem is that most people no longer trust the media anyway. And they did that to themselves. They may have swept it under the rug and tried to memory hole it, but most of us couldn't help but notice that only one candidate was getting shot at, and only RFK was denied Secret Service protection. The only thing that gets the attention of those in power more than money is a massive grassroots movement, and we are seeing that now. One party has made it clear that they don't want to see or talk about the problems of real people. And they definitely don't want to attribute the source of the people's choices in the election to any cause that they can't dismiss or demonize, but it's happening anyway. Eventually, even they will have to change with the times. The people have reached a point where they are telling these institutions, these bureaucrats, these lobbyists, and these political ideologists, F you. They will fight us back because they have a lot to lose, but they can't fight a tidal wave of the people's will, not in a democracy. And most of us have decided that we have other priorities than whatever Trump is tweeting today. If you don't, well, then I'm sorry. But I have more important things going on in my life, and so do most people. So I guess you'll eventually adapt to this new world, because it's coming whether you wail about it or not. We need someone who's willing to cut through all of the invented complexity that is used to intentionally paralyze the system, who will lay down some clear-cut rules. We need to make laws that say that the FDA cannot accept funding from pharma because that's a conflict of interest. We need the NIH to have guidelines that redirect them back to foundational research again. We need to pass laws that do not allow people who make the nutritional guidelines to accept money from companies in the food industry. People like RFK and Callie Means understand the legalities of what needs to be done, and we need to cheer them on as they do it. We have to change the incentives, which presently are that the pharmaceutical industry, insurance companies, hospitals, and even medical schools and researchers make the most money when a child is sick for a lifetime. Let's address the simple foundational issues too. Why do Americans pay 10 times more to a pharmaceutical company than Germany does for the same drug? Why do we allow that? They can set whatever price they want to. That is what free markets are. But our government can also tell them that we are not going to pay more than Germany or Scandinavia does for the same drug, because that's free markets too. Whatever deal you give them, you either give us the same one or we don't do business. And that includes Ozempic. It's just not true that Americans don't care about anything, including their health. We are demoralized, that is true. But we want to be healthy. We don't want to be feeding these poisons and trash foods to our kids. Stop weaponizing the system against us. We want our doctors to have some basic nutritional education as a part of their medical training. We don't want 7 billion crappy Lunchables meals served in schools every year instead of real food, especially when we pay more for education than pretty much anyone else in the world. As this movement grows and is able to influence things from the top down at the same time that it works to keep the momentum from the grassroots up, things will change. If laws are passed from above while more people become aware down below and refuse to buy a lot of these foods, it will affect these companies' all-important profit margins, and they will change. How do I know? Because they did it for Europe and Australia. They will want the money. So they will comply with using only the 400 chemicals allowed in Europe if we make it clear that we won't buy their products otherwise. We want to thrive. We want to feel energy and vitality. We want to be healthy and know that our children are going to be healthy. We want to be successful and contribute good things to the world. So quit being so selfish and greedy and get out of our way. No one wants to ban Coca-Cola. We should have the freedom to choose, and occasionally we are going to choose some sugary treats. But the government should not be subsidizing the worst foods while putting no resources into healthy foods, or allowing companies to hide a bombardment of toxic chemicals in virtually everything just so they can make more money. Put some of that Ozempic money into supplements and gyms and public pools and activity centers. How about you subsidize organic fruits and vegetables and grass-fed beef and fresh fish? We don't incentivize cigarettes with subsidies, and we shouldn't incentivize unhealthy foods either. If you have PCOS in Europe, which is the leading cause of female infertility, you get a subsidized keto diet. Because PCOS is actually insulin resistance. It's on the diabetes spectrum. In Europe, they know that the most effective intervention to reverse PCOS and become fertile again is to go on a 12-week keto diet. But here in the USA, the standard of care is to go straight to taking synthetic hormones and start down the route to IVF, which should be a last resort because it's so invasive and cost prohibitive. Sometimes drugs are the answer, but we are completely unbalanced right now. We need to make it possible for people to choose healthier lifestyles as easily as they would choose to take a pill, especially when the healthier lifestyle often has better results than the pills do. People with depression who go to therapy and start taking SSRIs have worse outcomes than people who do not go to therapy and do not take any pill who address their depression through healthy eating and exercise. Those people have better outcomes at improving their depression. What would happen if the $1,600 a month per person that the government is fixing to spend on Ozempic was reallocated to giving people the option of using that money to transform our food system and to subsidizing healthier living for people like me who can't afford organic foods and gym memberships? Again, we don't incentivize cigarettes with tax dollars, and we shouldn't incentivize unhealthy foods either. If you have an acute medical problem, an infection, a burst appendix, a broken bone, medical intervention is exactly what you need. If you have a chronic condition, diabetes, obesity, depression, autoimmune disease, then how well is that medical intervention working for you? The stats show that the more we medicate those conditions, the more of them there are. The more SSRIs are prescribed, the more the depression rates are exploding. It's not like their way is working very well. It's important to remember that you have time when it comes to chronic problems, unlike acute ones. You can try changes first. You're not going to die tomorrow if you don't take a statin drug for your cholesterol. You can try lifestyle changes. There are 221 million prescriptions being written for statin drugs every year. Yet, heart disease continues to be the leading cause of death in the United States. It really is about stepping back, thinking about it, and giving yourself permission to try a new strategy, whether the finger waggers approve or not. You can always take the pill later on if you decide to. They just make everything feel like it's a life and death crisis that must be handled their way right now. The key is to remember it's not. Not with chronic health conditions. We should be subsidizing the healthy foods to make those the most affordable. The Farm Bill program, a $500 billion program, is virtually all going to commodity crops that are turned into ultra-processed foods. Less than 1% of that entire budget goes towards fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, beans, etc. And it devotes nothing towards regenerative agriculture. The pharmaceutical industry spends 5 times more on lobbyists than the oil industry does. There are 5 pharmaceutical lobbyists for every single government official. The healthcare industry is the biggest funder of TV news and of politicians themselves. They're the funders of the research. They fund the regulatory agencies too. They fund the NAACP and civil rights groups. And they weaponize issues like feminism, racism, and body positivity to get activists to do their dirty work for them by bullying and trying to shut up people who say any of this to others. Quote, we need a reset. We need to come together with the farmers, with the brave people in healthcare, and have a reset. I would just ask you, does it feel like it's a marginal issue, or does it feel like we need to have almost a spiritual reset here? And I think we can. If we keep focusing on this and keep pushing, I think we can really unleash what everyone wants. End quote. But many people are still unaware of any of this, and that's why the information ripple effect is so important. Only a few years ago, this information simply wasn't out there. And according to Callie, that's why people like Bill Gates, who has profited tremendously from the pharmaceutical industry via vaccines, wants to shut down the flow of information as he pushes his, quote, global health care initiative. Quote, if all these medications were crushing it, and there were no side effects, everyone should probably take them. But if that's not the case, then they really need to silence anyone who talks about it. I think COVID broke something open. It's awareness. We unfortunately see these bodies essentially as a box that we can either take things out of or put things in. Surgery is taking things out or put medications in. It's very dark. That's why I left. I had a really good friend who was with me in the hallway before taking a job as a cancer surgeon and tearful saying, I don't know if I can do this. When people come through the doors of the surgical oncology department here, they are going to get a surgery whether they need it or not. Those are her exact words. Again, every doctor I know is a good person, went into healthcare for noble reasons, but if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If that's what you know, and that's what you can offer people, that is what you're going to offer people. And especially with cancer, when people are hopeless and desperate, and you have something you can do for them, and it happens to be really profitable, this revolving door keeps happening. End quote. So much sounds good on paper, but the devil is in the details, like Obamacare, for instance. They talked about value-based care, paying doctors more for better outcomes. But even that project got co-opted by the industry. Instead of better quality outcomes, meaning that the patient got healthier, good outcomes was measured by how many patients were medicated on long-term medications. That was a good outcome instead of improved health. So a doctor who was able to reverse diabetes in 50% of his patients who no longer required medications would not qualify as having good outcomes and would not receive the increased payments. But a doctor who put those same 50 patients on a medication that they did not need and got them to comply with taking it would. Quote, "We all think, who are the uncorrupted medical experts who can figure this out? I think people like Elon Musk are much more important. Systems thinkers. We need systems thinkers to literally just start top down, looking at these agencies, looking at the web of incentives, and asking, what is something that makes sense to spur American health and disease reversal? We spend $4.5 trillion. It's growing at double the rate of GDP on basically managing Americans poisoning themselves. How do we successfully use that money to reverse these trends? Just let Americans choose. Give Americans the information. Let's give them the information on diabetes. Let's give them the information on obesity. Let's give them the information on the 72 vaccines. Let's give them the information on everything and trust that the American people aren't suicidal enough to want to kill themselves. We've infantilized the American people, their healthcare industry. The USDA says it's dangerous to grow food in your backyard. Literally, there's a war on whole food. Bill Gates said it's pseudoscientists who've said that trees help with global warming. And this is my comment. Trees absorb carbon. You learned that in like 3rd grade science class. I thought carbon was the boogeyman. So if carbon is bad and we want less of it, then how are trees that absorb carbon not a good thing? Gates is going to have to break that one down for me. Returning to the quote, he's literally putting up sunblockers. He's saying that it's anti-science to say that the future for developing countries and feeding them is anything other than lab-grown meat and ultra-processed food. We're in a bizarro world here. We need moral clarity. Do we need studies to tell us that regenerative ranching and more natural processes and not raping our soil to where there is only 40 crop cycles left, not trying to out-hack everything and spray poison over all the crops, we just need to get back to basics? Casey added, quote, "The immediate response to what Callie's saying is, that's going to decrease access. People are going to starve. This is an equity issue. People can't afford regenerative agriculture." Yeah, by design. That is also a systems issue. The fact that people can't afford that food is because we're subsidizing the shitty food. That's why at every level, the immediate backlash to saying any of this is, oh, that's elitist, classist, racist, whatever, because not everyone can afford this. But that is literally by design, and that could be changed as well. Right now, the average kid in America is spending less time outdoors than a maximum security prisoner. Maybe we should think about that. The fact that the pesticides, the plastics, the sleep, the stress, all these things, and somehow that's all too complicated, but we can jam kids for life with a shot weekly for $1,600 a month. This could be undone. It's just because we haven't had focus on it. But you can get this done in a year. I truly believe that RFK and Trump will focus on this, end quote. And as Joe Rogan added, quote, I think it's also something that truly should be a non-political issue in terms of bipartisan. I know they're labeling exercise, and I've seen them even label red meat consumption as being some sort of far-right thing. End quote. My personal favorite is when they even say that liking sunlight is far-right of people. Only if you're Dracula, you lunatics. Far-right? It's sunshine! Come on, people! Callie pointed out, quote, everyone wants this. It's not a partisan issue. We have to be clear-eyed. If we don't have moral clarity and people that are going to say, go away to these industries and have clear, level-headed thinking on what's actually happening, we're screwed. People are clamoring for answers here, and I do believe that a focus on chronic disease reversal can be a banner bipartisan initiative that will go down in history. Casey summed it all up saying, quote, we're so distracted, and by design. We're so obsessed on our phones 10 hours a day. You know, the average kid, I think it's 7 hours a day now on a screen. Tech has a great side, and feminism has a great side, but they get weaponized culturally to say that women don't cook. Being a mother is second-class citizenship. It's associated with like being property and slaves. Get out into the workforce. Rise the corporate ladder. And women now, 25% of them are on SSRIs. Divorce rates are 50%. Men are lost because basically women are saying, men don't have a role anymore. We got this. And kids are not being able to get that quality time with family to play and for wisdom to be passed down and to have home-cooked meals. We've totally lost our priorities and we're giving away our attention freely. We're so distracted that we're missing the existential issues that are happening here now. There's a way to get back to deep fulfillment and genuine health, but the chronic disease epidemic is part and parcel with all of this because our brains and our bodies are basically getting destroyed. And then it's a vicious downward cycle where if our bodies aren't strong and our minds aren't strong, we're actually less strong to face and push back against the things that are trying to capture our attention. You get a kid who's eating the dead food filled with the sugars and the seed oils, and their brain's inflamed. They're on the dopamine treadmill for life. So they're going to be more easy to succumb to the phone that hits the dopamine or the drugs down the road. I think you talked about this with Burgum. Like you put rats in a group and they have that purpose of community, they're not going to choose the heroin water. They're going to just choose the regular water. That's why the food is so interlinked with all of this. I just look at the food we're feeding our kids, and we're doing this because families feel strapped for time and money, and that's a societal issue. And we've also bought into this idea that both parents need to be working all the time for women to have any value in society, which is insane. And forgotten that parenting is the most precious, incredible act we possibly could do as humans, raising healthy, strong, critical thinking people. But because of all of these forces, we are just giving food to our families that is literally dead. Ultra-processed food is dead food. The second food comes out of the earth or is killed if it's an animal, it starts degrading. That's just what happens. And food has tens of thousands of molecular components in it that work miraculously with our cells to generate health. I mean, 67% of our calories are ultra-processed food. Totally dead, totally stripped of all those miraculous nutrients. And the average piece of fresh food is traveling 1,500 miles from the soil to our plates and is usually out of the ground for weeks. So we are literally eating dead food that has lost all of its magic that is God-given for us to have cells that function properly. Fundamentally, we need to just wake up and focus on life again. Get back to the core basics above all of this, which is that our life is a miracle. It is a miracle that we are here. It is so insane that we get to have this experience and privilege to be alive once. To have these finite number of days, and we're squandering that because we're distracted. This body is our temple. It's our one home, and we're destroying it. And that's not the best idea. We could actually be doing it differently. We could be honoring it, respecting it, letting it produce the energy it needs to produce to be able to reach our highest purpose in this one lifetime. And it's not that complicated. Everything we're saying is not the direction we're going in as a country, as a world. I don't understand that. It feels like we have an opportunity to elevate consciousness here on this planet for future generations, and we're choosing not to. But we could make a different choice today, all of us, by really digging deep into our spiritual strength and being bold right now. I think now is the moment, and it's above political. There are political tactics that I think can help bring it to fruition, but fundamentally, it starts with us, each of us individually believing that this life is a miracle and fighting for it. Rogan concluded, quote, "I hope that this being connected to Trump doesn't put people off to the point where they're not able to recognize that this is about all of us. It has nothing to do with political party. It has nothing to do with ideology. It's just about being a human being. The pursuit of constant money from these corporations has created this diffusion of responsibility where each person inside that organization doesn't feel responsible for the overall result. They're not all bad people. It's not demons running all these organizations. They are people that's been captured by a system that's been captured. And it's all about money. That's why those people cheered when they found out that Ozempic is going to be prescribed for everyone." End quote. I agree with Joe, but the motives don't really matter to me because I have no interest in playing judge and jury or in playing priest and granting absolution. The focus needs to be on change. We need to learn from what's been allowed to happen for so long in so many areas. The rot needs to be cleaned out. Laws and safeguards need to be put in place. These lobbyists need to be put out of work. And the endless government jobs need to stop. Today is hopefully a new beginning. Thank you for listening to this podcast, for hanging in there with me. I know it ran a bit long. I hope you will come back next week. And until then, have a good week, my friends.